welcome Mr. J Smooth, Jason Ford, UMW class president. Yeah, welcome to the World XP podcast. Pleasure to have you on. Hopefully, it'll be a good episode. Maybe not. No, I'm just playing.
I believe so.
So we were just talking before we got on about the removal of the slave block in Fredericksburg, and kind of what we felt about that. You had a couple of good points. Care to repeat those? Yeah, reiterate those.
Okay, so the scenario that we had played out was two different perspectives of what the slave block was. And it was from the perspective of me as a black individual, and then perspective of you as a white individual. And we explained that, from my perspective, seeing the slave block was a negative reminder of, what slavery was, the atrocities that were committed against black individuals in this country. And from your perspective, it was a reminder of where we've been, but also where we have come. We talked about how black people have made major leaps in society since, within 2 generations. And we kind of just talked about how when I see that, it is a negative reminder. And the idea that if you take that away, it brings peace to me, right?
Right.
Versus if you take it away, you no longer be able to see the physical reminder of what slavery was and the progress that we made. And you had mentioned that you would like to see that in a museum.
I think that would be the ideal place for it. But from my point of view, I'd rather have it be out where it is rather than nowhere, as if they just remove it and don't throw it away or put it somewhere else. That was kind of what I was getting at, to your point about how I viewed it as where we've come, but it's also that we still have work to do, as evidenced by the protests and all the rest of the stuff that's been going on. So totally get where you're coming from, and I agree 100%. It just is a different perspective, and it also depends on, I think a big part of it is education. It's like when you educate people about what slavery actually was, what these people went through on the ships, coming across the Atlantic, packed together and all this, and what they endured. It's like to actually take that into account and then be like, this is where it happened right here. It's like, oh wow, that wasn't that long ago, and it's super sobering for me. But at the same time, I understand that not everybody thinks like that. And we were talking earlier about seeing people coming back from downtown with throw up on the block and everything, people taking group pictures of it because they think it's funny, and that is not okay from my perspective at all, which is something we agree upon for sure. But yeah, so I guess it really just comes down to is the ideal place for you a museum as well?
They put one of those stands up that you kind of see at specific sites where it's kind of it goes up in slants.
Oh, the little sign thing?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it does, that is still there, and it explains what was there and what
they
the
put
slave
it
block
up?
was. It's already there.
Okay, cool.
But to go into the museum, it's kind of, I guess if it's put into museum, I guess I wouldn't have necessarily a negative opinion about that, because that's what museums are essentially for.
Right.
And I guarantee there's other displays in museums I've seen that are even more, I wouldn't say offensive, but more affecting. I've seen full KKK robes in some museums down in North Carolina. So I guess if you were to include the slave block in, especially the local museum here in down in Fredericksburg,
right,
that'd be appropriate.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The only comparison I have from coming at it from museums, the standpoint of museums, when I was in South Africa and they had the Apartheid Museum, they left no bone unturned. That was everything that happened. Nothing was left to the imagination. Nothing was whitewashed. They're or nothing was even watered down. It was this is what happened, because it was only, granted, it was only 20 or 30 years ago. So there was video footage of stuff, and they had screens all in the museum with video footage of people getting hosed and the rest of it. So they view it differently than we do, but it's still, I guess the point that I would venture to make is it needs to be somewhere where people can learn about it. History needs to not be erased. It happened. Was it bad? Yes. Do we need to know about it? Absolutely. Why? So it doesn't happen again. So the whole point of when people say let's remove it, it's okay, where are you putting it? Where's it going?
Are you just demolishing it?
Are you just getting rid of it? In which case I'm against it. If you're putting it somewhere, then I'm good with that. That's kind of where it's like it's a deeper, not I don't want to say deeper level of analysis, but like it's like what's the next step? What's the effect of this? Like, can we consider this, please, before somebody just shouts out with a bullhorn this needs to go? It's like, okay, well, what's the plan? I think that goes into kind of, so now with all the protests, it's like people are pushing police reform, but for what? Like, I think we were talking about the two, I think the Senate bill is the Republican-backed one, and the House bill is the Democrat-backed one. There's a couple differences, but by and large, they're pretty much the same, consisting of like chokeholds. What was the other two?
There was chokeholds. There was one for no-knock warrants. There was included in the bills no-knock warrants, and then they also had one. This one I talked about with the nationwide database for officers who have committed acts of police brutality. It kind of didn't make sense to me that if an officer contributed or I guess you could say contributed or committed
a complaint filed against them.
Yeah, if that's done in one jurisdiction, they can then be fired or leave that police station and go to another one and then get hired there, or even get referred by an officer who has connections in the other one.
Yeah,
and to me that didn't make sense. As we all know, police can get called on regardless of their jurisdiction. If there's a jurisdiction, across train tracks or across a bridge, they can get called to go assist another police station that is in the other jurisdiction.
Yeah, we saw that in Fredericksburg. The Stafford police was down there. Yeah,
exactly. So that really doesn't help to deter officers who have been found guilty, or even I guess I don't think they go to court for things like that. It's kind of all handled internally.
Yeah, the internal affairs people. It doesn't even hinder.
Which that makes sense. That doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't even hinder, honestly. It probably, if they need a fresh start or whatever, they can get referrals from. I mean, I'm not sure exactly how the internals work of all that, but it doesn't seem to be. Internal affairs does not seem to be doing its job, to say the least.
I've read a few accounts from old officers on social media about the culture that is found within police stations and the police force. It's not the most accepting in a sense of individuals who want to speak out against it. Dave Chappelle's comedy special had a discussion about it. I forget the officer's name, but it was an officer who was an ex-Marine or an ex-military who was working in LA. I don't know if you've seen the
846 one.
Yeah. So he talks about how that officer had a whole manifesto about like his idea and what he thought about it. Because he had already been an officer who had seen acts of police brutality and tried to speak out against it and essentially got blacklisted as an officer. I believe he got fired and everything.
Yeah.
And I've read accounts where a police officer has been transferred to another. He was on a case with an officer who had beat up this kid. He had broken his nose, and he tried to speak out against it. They didn't end up arresting the kid, and they had to make up a whole case against why they were even trying to. Ended up not happening, and he tried to report that officer to his supervisor.
Yeah.
Guy ends up getting transferred to that officer's unit, and then while on that unit, no one there provided backup to him when he went to any cases. And he had a meeting with I think it was the sergeant or whoever the superintendent was for that unit. Was like, watch what you say and watch when you try and stab other officers in the back, or you're not going to get backup when you need it.
Yeah.
And when you foster that kind of culture within, police force, you then create people who no longer, like, even if you are the good apple within a sea of bad ones, you're then forced to then be compliant with what's going on because it is your livelihood.
Yeah, you got to pay for your kids, food for your kids, and
that's your career. And let's say you've been working in that since you were about in your 20s, you're now 30. And maybe in the area you worked at was different. You may have transferred and things were different. That's all you know. That is now your career. That is what you've been working towards.
Yeah, Sammy and Izzy were talking about that when they were at the protest. Sammy said he went up to, on the first episode, which you guys should go watch.
Definitely go watch.
They were talking about how they went up to one of the officers and were like, "What are you doing? Like, why are you here?" And he's like, "Because I got to put food on the table." And it's like, you have that moral dilemma, I feel like, if you're an individual within these departments where you want to speak out, but at the same time, you're like,
the consequences.
The consequences, like, it's a decision like that is such risk-based. Am I willing to take the risk of alienating myself and perhaps not get a new job just so I can do the right thing? It's like, no, I'd rather set my kids up for a better future. And
I think that's the issue.
that's an issue, but it's so understandable.
Mhm.
It's so relatable
Mhm.
to not want to ruffle feathers so your kids can have a better future.
I've been telling my mom about similar situations like that. She's been very cautious about posting stuff on social media right about now.
Right.
Especially how she says employers will look towards your social media.
They do, definitely.
And I've been trying to tell her that and I'm not like the biggest, I'm not out there going crazy on social media saying nothing wild, but I've definitely been sharing things that I think are essential to see and my perspective on a lot of things.
Sure.
And I've been trying to exactly, and I've been trying to tell her that if an employer sees the things that I'm saying now and find them either offensive or against company policy, or if seeing that I wouldn't be a good fit there, I found that God will put me in places where He wants me to be at. And if I'm trying to apply to a place and that's the reason that they don't think I'd be a good fit there, I don't need to belong there.
Yeah,
I don't want to be in that. I don't want to be in that country,
anyways.
or it's not even that country, that
That
company,
culture.
and exactly a company that fosters that type of culture. Because I won't be able to thrive there. I probably won't. If that's how the leadership is, then how are the people who are then working there in some of the lower positions? More than likely where I'd be entering at.
Yeah, exactly.
So then that type of mind state, if that's how it is for police officers, where it's like I can't say anything against the police officers I'm with because then I would lose out. I can't say that for everyone that they should look, but personally, I couldn't find myself there. As I know, my moral compass. We kind of talked about, was it morality isn't law and law isn't morality? Or based on morality?
Like all laws are not moral and not all morals are laws.
Yes. My moral compass would then tell me this isn't where you're supposed to be. I want to work somewhere where I can make an impact, where I can make change and actually help benefit people.
Definitely.
And in some cases, I guess in a perfect world, police officers are there to protect people, and you're able to then give back to your community.
Yeah.
What we are seeing now is the opposite of that.
It's not the same.
Where the communities are in fear of the officers,
Mm-hmm.
or they are the ones who are perpetrating, I wouldn't necessarily call them atrocities, but,
I mean, some of them are.
some of them very much are atrocities, but not in every case. But you're definitely abusing,
It's an abuse of power.
An abuse of power. And if you find yourself as you're the individual who wants to actually help contribute to the community, I feel like that's a contradiction. And guaranteed
It is. I feel like most people go in though with that feeling, with the moral compass of, hey, I'm going to do the right thing, and then they find themselves swept up in this culture of better not telling anybody, or you're not going to have a job.
Exactly.
And by the time you get swept up in it, hey, your first kid's on the way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, oh, what do I do now?
Mm-hmm.
And it's the moral situation is definitely not the easiest. But yeah, like you were saying, if a company looks at you post Black Lives Matter or Blackout Tuesday, and they're like, you posted a black square, we don't want to hire you. It's like, I don't want to work there anyways. So that's a whole nother company. It's like another one of the rungs that everything is so convoluted with. It's just another area where there needs to be some sort of reform.
Mm.
But how? And it's also not the one that is the most pressing, though, which is why company cultures, which is why people don't talk about it, tolerance within company cultures, or even the workplace. It's kind of, not that it's not important, but it's less pressing than somebody that got killed by a cop.
And what do you mean by that? Like the culture of the company is going to, get headlines in a sense?
Yeah, it's less pressing as far as okay, right now, women or people of color get paid less on the dollar.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, that's a problem that needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm.
But what needs to be addressed first is people dying, because getting paid less, a couple cents less on the dollar is not going to kill you.
Mm-hmm.
It's not
Police
to say
violence can.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's not to say it's not a problem, but
it's an issue that can be resolved within a single company too. And
that's true.
You can argue that what we're seeing now with police is a systemic issue, and it could be a symptom, as we talked about, or as we heard with the Bert Weinstein podcast.
Yeah,
is that they are symptoms of a much deeper issue in our country, and I think that's one of the things that we're looking to chat about.
Very much so. I think so. The other issue the other important part for me of the police reform policies was the qualified immunity. And I know you've taken more political and law sorts of classes than I have, and so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that that was put into place to prevent officers from getting personally sued while on the job.
I took some notes on it as well.
Okay. Is that correct or kind of off a little bit?
So this is from the article that we read up on. There's a little blurb that stuck out to me completely. And it said the doctrine allows government officials breathing room to make reasonable but potentially mistaken judgments about open legal questions. And as we talked about earlier, how the training that an officer gets within, I think it was 6 weeks or in a time period similar to that, to then go out on their own and to then help to try and enforce the law.
Right.
Versus a lawyer who goes through undergrad and then 3 years of law school to then go to a courtroom to then have to, enforce, but either defend someone or apply that law to someone.
Right.
The disparity in time.
Time, education,
exactly.
training. It's like,
exactly.
How long is law school? 3 years? 4 years?
3 years.
3. So you
so
have
on top of under 4 years.
You have pre-law, 4 years of like pre-law or whatever your undergrad is. Then another 3 years of law school. Then once you get to the first firm, then it's like another couple years while you're an understudy to somebody else. And then by the time you get your own case, it's like 10 years by that time.
And then versus an officer who gets between 6 weeks, let's say, to a max of 3 or 4 months of training.
Yeah.
Going through the academy to then get put right out onto the force. And I don't know if exactly that's the exact time frame. But it's not 10 years. It's not 10 years of training to be able to go out and make sure that you can protect the communities in the proper way that they need to be protected. And that's another discussion that we kind of talked about, is that are police officers the ones who need to respond, or are they responding in every single case? Is it then are they necessary to be called on?
I don't think so. I think we need to rethink how we view the police. It's like, are there some cases where the police are necessary? Absolutely. Drunk driving case, or like even some domestic abuse cases. I feel like you send a cop with a social worker or a cop with somebody else. But then you get into the issue of what if the dude is super violent and the social worker's unarmed and the social worker gets killed? Then it's then you run into that whole weird gray area about who's responsible, who's liable for that, and then it's do you send that person? Do you not? Okay, well, the cop might be more violent, so then that's a whole other question. But to answer your initial question, I think we definitely need to rethink how the police, what their role in society is, to go to more towards the Peace Corps rather than warriors or whatever, or trying to they sit on they hide on the side of the road and try and get people for speeding tickets. It's no. It's unless that person is going 30 over, if they're going 10 over, 15 over, honestly, the speed limit on the highway outside is 55 miles an hour.
This one right here?
Yeah. In what world is 395? What world does anyone go 55 miles an hour? And so when you're going 70 with the flow of traffic, it doesn't seem bad. But then when they write it on the ticket, hey, you were going 70 to 55, it looks horrible. You were going 15 over? It's well, yeah, because everybody else was.
Where you're trying to catch up to the rest of the
traffic. And so that's one of those things where it's you need to rethink what the priorities are. I think, anyways. But so I think so for the Republican-backed bill, qualified immunity is not touched, I believe, and the Democrat one, it is. And I struggle to understand why both sides. I don't know enough about it to make a judgment call. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it is something that can be looked at, and this kind of ties back to what I found in the article, based on where did the idea of qualified immunity even come from, and how is it applied? And we're gonna get nosy here real quick. There's 2 cases, actually technically 3 cases, but 2 big cases to focus on. And it's Pearson versus Callahan and Saucier versus Katz.
Okay.
And this is, I'm reading straight from the notes, and it says Pearson established the precedent requiring courts to grant immunity on 2 bases: a violation of a constitutional right for someone they're looking to arrest, and whether a precedent or established law already exists. Right. Saucier broke this by granting immunity after only observing if there was a precedent or established the law, and not if a person's rights were violated, essentially boiling the eligibility for qualified immunity from 2 points down to 1. That causes an issue.
Problem.
It causes an issue. Not necessarily, that's not solely the problem. But when you talk about, having the ability or actually being successful in charging an officer these type of cases come into issue. What I learned from a legal case was, especially, and as I just said, if you're the first person to, get hurt in a certain way by a police officer, you try to take them to court, you're out of luck. Because there's no precedent. There's no established law that says this is illegal.
So they get super specific, don't they?
Very
They'll
super
be like,
specific.
oh, well, you weren't hit in the left shoulder with the police officer's right hand of a baton of this length. No precedence.
Yep. So, and the issue with that is that when you look at Saucier's case, it breaks it down just that. Regardless, before if there was no precedent, but you did violate their rights, now it goes on the books.
Yeah.
Right.
But they took that away.
They took that away without having to look at your violation of right. If it's already on the books, you can get charged. But because they can get very specific, this has never happened before, qualified immunity granted. And the way cases work, if you already cite a case that has already been established,
right,
you're pretty much done because now it's almost an identical case.
Yeah. You
know what I mean? So if I attack you in a very specific way and I take you to court, right? And it becomes our case.
Yeah.
If an officer does that and changes, let's say, the location of it, right? The location of where it's done, or if you push me down or I push you down in a specific location and that gets put into the case, that makes it now different. Therefore, there is no precedent for exactly what happened.
Even though it
did. Even though
it
did, and regardless if you violated my constitutional right, they're not looking towards the Pearson case. They're focused on the Saucier case. So when it comes to the court of law, stuff like that gets very specific, and reading up on that kind of made me understand that there's loopholes in it.
Yeah.
And when it comes to courtrooms and judges, you understand why people put so much emphasis on getting judges. Understand why this presidency has confirmed a large number of judges during these past 4 years. Right. To understand that regardless of what the law says, if I interpret it a certain way and then put it on the books, it now has a precedent.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like if I vote or if I judge something in a certain direction or a certain way, it's now on the books. Period.
Right.
You know what I mean? And regardless of whether or not the law is there to follow it, there's always, in the case of Saucier, there's already a case that says I can do it this way. Regardless if there used to be 2 requirements, and people used to cite that one. I don't have to cite that. Even if you cite that case in the courtroom.
Because the precedent has been changed.
Well, not even if it changed. I can cite another case.
Yeah.
If you cite the Pearson one saying, okay, you violated my rights and you did this, and let's say there isn't a precedent on the book. So let's say there is a precedent on the book, so you can find them for that. If they only go by Saucier, or the Saucier case, I don't know exactly how you say his name, and you find that however they framed it, that there is no precedent, they don't even look towards if your constitutional rights are violated. So issues like that goes, and that's where the whole idea of, it's bigger than just the police. Yeah. Then you go into, all right, if you have an encounter with the police, you try and enforce, the law upon them, you then have to take it to a courtroom to have it settled.
Yeah, and then there's its own set of issues as well. So, do you think that these reforms are enough to satisfy the Black Lives Matter movement or their goals? Or what do you think their goals
I think it's treading lightly.
Well,
I can't even sound Republican half. But I do know the Democratic bill is definitely treading lightly. And I'm not saying you need to completely reform it. I think it does need to be looked at in a much deeper aspect than it is. I'm not actually, we did read up on it, but I can't remember exactly what the bill said. I should have took notes on that specifically. But I do believe that it's something that needs, well, first and foremost, needs to be bipartisan. And the fact that you can have the Republicans have pretty much saying we're not touching this whatsoever, like this is a no-go for us, is already putting up a wall in the first place.
It's a weird thing because they're both saying it about the other ones, even though the bills are about 70% the same. I think the only real difference is the qualified immunity. Everything else is the same, but they're both like, no, we're not going to talk to you, which is not good, which also means nothing gets done, which means that either the Black Lives Matter movement peters out, or unless there's some group or person that takes charge as like the leader, there's no leader of this movement to negotiate with for what needs to get done. So they being Congress is just off the cuff saying like, yeah, we think this will be fine. But
and
it's like
having no one to actually discuss whether.
Yeah, there's no discussions with people on the street. I mean, like, well, what do you guys see? What do you want? That's terrible leadership. You're a good leader. You're going to go talk to people. Say, hey, what do you see? Like, let's come up with a plan, because then once you talk to those people, and those people have buy-in because they're part of the plan. Right now, there's no buy-in because nobody trusts Congress. And so, regardless of if they get this passed, there's no... And so that puts Congress in a lose-lose, because they have no one to negotiate with to even show that leadership. Not that they would anyways, but let's assume that they would. There's no one to do that with. So then what is the goal? I've heard a lot of defund the police, abolish the police.
Which could be skewed, as we talked about. It could be skewed or painted in weird or very different
which
lights.
can be skewed. Yeah, and the problem with that is it's a headline. It's a catchy thing without any nuance. So if you defund the police, we're going to jump in a little bit, but if you defund the police, right now, police don't make... I don't know what the exact number is, but they don't make a lot. What incentive do people who are qualified have to become cops? It's like someone who has the temperament, the capability to actually have the gun and the badge and be in a position where they can be in charge of somebody's life. The people who are capable of that are off running companies and managing people and teams, and like are doing all sorts of great things, because those are the people that have the capabilities to do that. There's no incentive for those people to become police. People that become police are either they have a sense of duty, or two, they can't get another job.
And that's their interest.
And that's their interest. And almost if you... So it's weird. It's like, so you're saying you're gonna defund the police. It's like, okay, well, if you have less money to pay the cops, you're gonna get less quality people.
And that's something we discussed earlier.
Which is a problem, because if you think of yourself as a marketable entity, like, what will the market pay for my skill set? X number of dollars. The less salary that is available, the less quality of service or individual you're going to get wanting to do that. And then, to me, that seems like the cycle will then just repeat itself. And then on top of that, the same thing goes with the training. If you want the best training, you're going to have to put money into that. Right now, the best the people who are the best at training are like in the SEAL teams and the Army Rangers and like all that, because they get paid more there. Nobody wants to come train the cops because they don't get paid anything to do it. It's like, I think Jocko, especially now that everybody, like the wide consensus of public opinion is anti-police for the most part, except for like the people who are running around with the American flags with the blue stripe. But like Jocko Willink, he's a former Navy SEAL. He was in charge of the tactical training for the SEAL teams. He would run those guys through scenario after scenario after scenario with simunition, and they'd watch it back and be like, what can I do better? Like, cops don't get that sort of training. That's what they need, but that training costs money. So if you take money away from them, what are you left with? Like, I don't...
And my thing is, and we discussed this earlier, is about the amount of money that police units do get, or police departments, and wherever it is, state, local, or federal. Where does the money specifically go? And now we're talking about training and how we have to talk about increased funding towards training. My gripe with it is the amount of military-style equipment that the police do get.
Oh, for sure.
And
they don't need that.
They don't need all of the equipment. And it's weird to see them painted. And I'm not a police officer, but I swear that some of them choose the police being a police officer instead of a military, and they still see it in the same paradigm.
Definitely.
In the same structure.
It's almost like I don't have to go through boot camp, and I still get to have this giant gun.
Guns. I still get to have all of the gear, and 9 out of 10 times they end up either keeping some of the gear or having some of the gear at home.
Yeah.
Then they choose to go buy their own weapons, and nothing's wrong with owning weapons. But it's the mentality that you get from being a police officer. It's as we talked about earlier, the structure and the entire entity of a police department, and the way they see things, the way they think, the way they treat the people who are on the police force. They see it as a brotherhood.
Yeah.
And it's weird. It's weird because I was talking to my mom about this, and it feels like they're almost like domestic military is how they see themselves.
Yeah.
And it's almost like we are the foreigners in another, like if they're in another country like in Iraq. We are the foreigners that they see us. They're there to protect their country, they're there to protect the flag and enforce the law. And we're the people. American citizens are the ones who are then causing the issue. and they're the ones being called upon to go and resolve the
Yeah.
issue. All the it's weird to see them continually react with more brutality when the entire purpose of the protest is to protest police brutality.
Yeah.
I'm like the whole point of the movements is getting missed.
Yeah.
You know,
it is for sure. So I guess instead of is reallocation of funds.
Reallocation of funds.
Yeah,
to see
probably
the budget and exactly where the money is going.
Yeah.
To try and reshape it from that point.
Yeah. So that would cause some oversight then. It's like from where I
Mhm.
guess. Oh, one of the other things in the police reform bill, there was we already talked about the national database, but if they were to do something similar, a national database for budget accountability,
Mhm.
where's the money going?
Mhm.
That would probably be useful,
Mhm.
I guess. I'm hesitant to say useful because I would almost not want the government to be in charge of that
Mhm.
because they're already wrapped up in the whole scheme system type deal.
Mhm.
Some independent auditing third party
Mhm.
type deal might be best.
Do you think it's something the public should be able to see, or specifically?
No, I have nothing in specific. I just I know there's companies that come in and do audits and that sort of thing. Something like that would probably be, but it would have to be like yearly, like a yearly annual audit,
Mhm.
and then that data would have to get reported back to some governing body that would say like, okay, they're not complying. We're going to take away federal funding from them because they didn't comply, and that would be the incentive for them to comply because they wouldn't get the funding the following fiscal year.
And that's something I'm pretty sure that the bills talk about.
Yeah, it's like if they don't ban chokeholds,
Mhm.
then they're not going to get the federal funding. Whereas the Democrat bill just makes it illegal to use them, which I don't.
My issue with the whole incentive one is you're still leaving it in the department's hand to report it whether or not.
Sure.
You know, so if they choose to report it, and you know, I guarantee, especially in New York, police departments already are kind of shady about what they report.
Mm-hmm.
They have cases that they're like not necessarily going to resolve, but issues that get reported to them that don't even go on the books.
No.
So
yeah, for sure.
If you're talking about then withholding federal funds, if you don't exactly tell us everything all of the times,
then they have no incentive to tell, which is where
Exactly.
they would have to go get audited. But so it's a whole. It's like that's what kind of the structure of what needs to happen. But then to make sure it actually happens is another issue. I don't know. But the thing is with some of the departments, like if they're so corrupt that there's no changing them, it's like you think you should abolish that police department. Fine, let's explore it. Let's see why they're as corrupt, what is making it that way, and then we can build a new one. But to abolish it without a plan in place is almost like I know this is the extreme of, but like when in Seattle, that group took over that like 6-block radius and turned it into their own like little, they called it an autonomous zone, and like little warlords pop up, or like when Izzy was talking about in the first episode, gangs pop up when the state fails the people to protect the people. If there's no police, then it's like, okay, well that vacuum of power is going to get filled somehow, and sometimes what fills it is worse than what was already there, and so that's another thing to be aware of. I guess it's extreme, but also it already happened in Seattle and Portland for a little bit, but they tried to do it to the mayor's apartment. The cops cleared it out in like a day, so like. But still, I don't know.
mentioned that is the extreme.
Yeah.
So,
but possible though, nonetheless.
Yeah.
And especially as divisive as things have become. Like 2 years ago, I would never have dreamed that I'd have seen a 6-block radius of a city blockaded by citizens with guns. Never would have even dreamed. And now 2 have popped up in the space of 2 weeks. So yeah, it's extreme, but also not unfathomable, especially if things don't get fixed. And who's to say that things are getting fixed because there's no leader of the movement to negotiate with? So we're really, I don't see how this ends unless someone takes charge, like steps up and says, like, with the support of the movement to negotiate on their behalf. I don't really see a way to get out of it based on the circumstances that we've just laid out.
Well, that is something we talked about, though, is the idea of a leader for a movement. The whole Black Lives Matter movement has a group of founders. They have a group of people who created the movement and who started this, I believe, back in 2012. Don't quote me on exactly the date, but it's been around.
I think 2012 or 13. I
It's
think
been around
Obama
for
was
some
still in
years.
office, yeah.
It's been around for some years. But from a historical standpoint, the idea of leading a movement, especially this big now, it's spread internationally,
Mm-hmm.
it's already on the radar of the government.
Right.
And to have one person who is the leader of the movement
or even a group, though. Or even a group that will negotiate on behalf of...
like like the creators of the movement.
Yeah.
Correct? Like this clearly was an idea, and the
Mhm.
name came from a group of people.
Right.
So in my mind, I could see that group of individuals being the ones to step up and create a game plan for the Black Lives Matter movement, to send it out through their emails and say, this is what we are looking to achieve, and actually have the set game plan.
So have you
Had
heard from them?
That I don't know. I'm on their email list,
Uh-huh.
and I do get a lot of information and newsletters, but I've yet to see a full game plan laid out. Now, I'm not saying there isn't one. There may
Sure.
be one that I haven't seen.
Well, it'd be nice if they were to release it, because I haven't seen it.
Well,
I haven't seen it either.
Exactly. But there may be one. But the whole idea of having a leader, especially nowadays, can come with way more than just being the one person to talk to. When you take a look at society and the way society kind of paints people who gain, I wouldn't even call them celebrities, gain importance or be influencers.
Mhm.
They kind of either try to find dirt on them, they try to paint them in a certain light, and regardless of how, what their objective case is, look at Colin Kaepernick. People are still going to say what they think about what they're doing in their own perspective. And then from just a historical standpoint, what I was just saying is that the government doesn't necessarily take too fondly to individuals who step up and actually try and speak out against the system that is set up. If you look at like the leaders of the civil rights movement, either they were assassinated or the movement itself was crippled.
Yeah.
Take for example the Black Panther Party.
Yep.
The leaders of that got killed,
Yeah.
brutally got killed.
Yeah.
So it's hard to be the person to want to step up when you see, one, the history of it,
Sure.
and two, you understand the social society that we live in,
Yeah.
the social construct of what the internet that's out now with social media, and
Yeah.
how people will try and portray it or try and skew what the actual idea of it is.
It's a difficult one then, because I agree. I wouldn't want to do that.
Mhm.
But at some point,
There needs to be direction.
somebody has to provide some sort of direction, because if they don't, then like we were saying, the politicians have no guide, because they're not going out to talk to anyone.
No, I feel like that's an issue that needs to be discussed.
That is an issue as well, but they're just kind of making it up, and that's not good either. So I don't know, and then it just becomes this cycle where the policing keeps going, and then it cripples the communities that it affects disproportionately. Like especially in the Black community, we touched on this with Sam and Izzy as well. But the amount of single parent households is like some absurdly high number. And I know you were talking about generational. The generational like symptoms of that. You want to elaborate on that?
So understanding that, and as you touched on how when you have police either being the one to incarcerate Black men or kill them in the ways that they do, it leaves a gap in a child's life.
Right.
And that's not necessarily something that you have to think too hard about. It's a simple understanding.
Right.
You understand that when a piece of the family unit is missing, it then creates a generational issue, or can create a generational issue. I'm not saying it's guaranteed, but it's easily to see that
the likelihood is higher.
Yeah, the likelihood is higher because they don't have what does it look like to have two parents who are there to support you when you need them, who are there to support you financially, and there to help guide you when you come across things. If you have now had one who has been incarcerated for, let's say for a charge that may or may not have been a violent charge, and they've been put away for a long periods of time.
Yeah.
You now have a perspective of the government that has now taken your dad away.
Right.
You know what I mean? So then you kind of grow up with that resentment, or if your mom is working 2 or 3 jobs to try and provide for you, you're then kind of navigating through that life on your own. You're not. You don't have anyone there to then help shape you and help teach you. All right, this is what you got to do when you get into these type of situations.
Right.
Making sure that you're good when you come across that. So when you have a child grow up like that in that type of environment, it's easy to see how it's the stereotype of, this kid is a problem child. He comes, he has anger issues, or he has issues with this. Well, he doesn't have anyone in his home to help him with those issues.
Right.
You know what I mean? Understand that this is you're looking at the symptom of what the problem is,
right,
rather than what the problem is itself.
Yeah. There's also an interesting biological standpoint to that. It's like when I was listening to a podcast and it was a biologist was talking about when you take a large portion of the males out of any given population, the males who are left become in higher demand from a mating perspective, and then they don't have the incentive to stick around and create that family structure that you were talking about. So not only is it they're incarcerated, but the ones who are left have less of an incentive to stick around because they're in higher biological demand by the females of that community. And that's, from what biologists were saying, that's across the board. If you take a large portion of the males out of any community, that's kind of what happens. So that is compounded on top of the fact that they're growing up without dads and they don't have the role models, and then they do the same thing of either they get jailed or killed, and then the ones who are left, is just the cycle repeats itself, and the opportunities to get out aren't there and won't be there until that's addressed, which is...
And at face value, that does make sense. And as you were explaining it earlier, it made sense. But I don't know. Hearing it again, it feels like, in the fact of the matter is it a fact? Yes. But when you're trying to understand it and look at it from,
it's a compounding factor. It's not the only factor. It's a compounding one. And
the podcast, the fact that he mentioned it made sense, and I expressed this to you when we talked earlier. I don't think that's necessarily what should be focused on. No. Granted, is it a fact? Maybe. Yes, it could be a fact.
Yeah, I agree. It shouldn't be the focus, but to understand why it's so bad, that needs to be understood as it's not just stop jailing. It's stop jailing, and then it'll take a generation or two for this biological thing to also kind of come out of this, out of the population or the community. So it's like you do this one thing, and people are like you do police reform, and it doesn't change for a generation or two. People are like,
people
why?
Argue it doesn't work.
People are like, oh, well, it didn't work. It's like, okay, well, this other thing needs to be considered as well. Should it be the main focus? No. Should it be talked about, though? I would argue yes, due to that fact. Especially because if people don't see change immediately, then it's like, well, it didn't work anyway, so why did you even do it? It's like, well, no, just patience, let it kind of, it's an important kind of anecdote, I feel like, to that issue. It's something that I hadn't considered before. But yeah, like you said, that it shouldn't be the main focus to the single parent household issue. Shouldn't be the main focus at all. But it is an important part of the issue nonetheless.
I'd be curious to see what
opinion,
percentage, or if you could even factor out a percentage for that, of what type of, how that actually contributes to the greater discussion at hand.
I'm sure there's studies done about not within this particular one, but if you pull a group of males out of the population, what happens to the kids of any mammal species, probably, or any species where both parents are involved in the raising of the child or offspring or whatever. I feel like there are studies done on.
I feel like that's difficult though if it's not a human.
Yeah, it's different. It's different for sure. Humans is different
because it's one thing to just pull them out, but it's also when you're talking about humans, when you're talking about black people, how are you pulling them out?
Yeah,
and the ways that they're being pulled out
makes it worse than
not necessarily makes it worse. That's the key issue. Because if you're talking about mass incarceration on a scale that on basis that's either non-violent offenses or the 3-strike laws in California, or even just
drug
being
offenses
killed.
Or whatever. Yeah.
Yes, that then leaves an impact. The fact that how they get pulled out of the structure, I guess you can call it society, as you say.
Yeah.
So the way they're being pulled out is the issue at hand. Not necessarily, okay, they're getting pulled out, now there's, one male for every 4 women. Now it's easier for him to, to go have sex with each one of these women and then have kids, and then now he gets to pick which one he wants to go to. It's bigger than that in the sense.
It is. Definitely.
Yeah.
It is definitely bigger. I'm not trying to take away from the initial issue at hand, but yeah. Okay.
So, but when you see it from that perspective as, let's say if there was an equal amount for each one, and, in the ideal world there should be. You shouldn't have to have, disproportionately more African American males going to jail or being killed by police than there are any other kinds. But That's the world we live in. So when you see it from that perspective, and instead of understanding, and from this gentleman's perspective, and I'm going to say he's a biologist, so that's what he would look at.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at it from the perspective of, okay,
evolutionary biologist.
Yeah.
Specifically. It's a little twist onto like how people evolve and how their like the instincts evolve rather than just it's a nuance. But
I'd be curious to ask him if he sees it from the perspective I'm trying to explain it from, or if is his only focus on specifically the biological standpoint of it.
And for everybody who doesn't know what we're talking about, Brett Weinstein was on Joe Rogan's podcast like 3 or 4 days ago. He brought up a couple of very interesting points. A couple of those were, well, one I just brought up with Jason, but I wanted to know what his thoughts were on that. I don't want to speak for him, but I would venture to guess that his point would be so many people are already talking about that and no one is talking about
his perspective,
the biological part, and so it's important to bring it up. Would be my guess, would be how he would respond. Obviously I'm not trying to put words in his mouth, but I've heard what you're saying way more. Like I've heard what you're saying from multiple people, like all different like places, people who understand how the cycle works. That's the first time I've heard that
perspective.
Yeah.
And it is a different perspective. Definitely a different perspective.
It's almost like a supplement.
Yeah, but it's based on fact. As you can say, it is based on fact. What contributing factor does that fact have? I don't know.
No,
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if there is research on that, but from at face value, it is kind of, and this is kind of where my responses come from. Is may it be true? Yes, and we've said this as well. May it be true? Yes, but is that the focus of what we are focused on now?
No.
Not necessarily.
Yeah,
it still is fact.
Yeah,
so
definitely. And he brought up another good point about biological systems within the brain, that like the instincts that lead to how human beings can take any terrestrial like environment and use it to their advantage. And what he was talking about with the slave trade was you were taking people out of their ancestral environment, taking them out of their culture, thrusting them into a new, different environment. So all of what they had known before no longer applied. They had no common culture because they mixed people from all different places in Africa. As far as like, they didn't keep all the people from like Ghana together or Cote d'Ivoire together. It was all mixed up. So there was no common culture. So then they had to make their own, and that set them back biologically as well. And that was another point that I hadn't considered from like, yes, did all the atrocities happen to where at face value, okay, they didn't have the money, they didn't have the generational wealth or the access to education or that, but it set them back
mentally.
More than mentally, because we were talking about before about how if you're taught so often that like people don't like how you look, you're talking about how people in like the 30s would use like chemicals on their hair to make it straight or whatever. But it's even deeper than that. It's like your instincts, your deepest instincts at your core were taken away from you. And that is far worse than what, like, not to say that the other stuff isn't bad, because it's horrible. That's far worse than that. Your deepest instincts no longer apply. And that is a horrible, horrible thing to take away from a group of people, especially like the Black community and Native Americans, to take like groups that reside on the East Coast and stick them on the West Coast and like with nothing. It's a horrible, horrible thing. So I don't know what you thought about that as well.
Now, what aspect? Just them getting moved from?
Just generally that deeper part, like to go deeper in past the face value of there's no generational wealth, or there's no like the education wasn't there, the opportunities wasn't there. Like,
so I can talk on what we mentioned earlier as well. More or less backtracking, but how I mentioned that Black people are like the only group of individuals in the country that have been taught to dislike themselves,
right?
And how the image of being like a white person, as I mentioned with the whole conking the hair and trying to straighten it through chemicals, where the idea that is if you are Black and you have natural curly hair and you have the natural everything about you that has been God given to you, you no longer like, and you then strive to try and be like a white person. What other group in this country has been put through so much turmoil on top of that. You know what I mean? And the fact that, and this kind of compounds back to everything, even, you know, with the black family unit, excuse me. But the idea that you can grow up around other black people and just kind of have the idea that, you know, especially if you're going to a mixed school where there's, you know, all kinds of races, and you're looked at as you're on the lower rung.
Right.
You kind of look around yourself. You first look at yourself, understanding what is it about me that put me on the lower rung. There's no difference between me or any other student in the class.
Right.
You know, but we have the same amount of grades. It's simply based on the color of my skin. You grow to resent that because of how other people then view you.
Sure. Yeah.
You know what I mean? You kind of get to not self-idolize, but you internalize how society sees you.
Yeah.
And there's examples of people like that throughout society, but you see it from the perspective of they do whatever they can to then get away from their blackness because they've been told and it's been portrayed and painted as if that is what's wrong. It's simply the color of your skin is what's wrong. So they do whatever they can to get away from it, whether it be, you know, speak out against other black people or just change the texture of your hair to try and make it more resemblance of a white person's. What that in itself leaves damage in generations. And how we talk about biology, when you do something like that to a human and to a race of human, that leaves generational scars. You know what I mean?
That are not easily fixed by any means.
If you can even fix them. Because now, let's say you internalize those things, right? And you become successful by turning against your people, in a sense. By I wouldn't necessarily say turning against them, but by choosing to be more like a white person than it is like a black person. By saying, oh, you're just dirty, you're impoverished, or you're, what they call them, dependent people if they're on welfare. If you were in a place where you were privileged enough to make it out, and that is the perspective that you now have. Like, who's there to tell you that that's incorrect in a sense?
No one.
Because now that you believed it, you've now internalized it, and then you've made it out. You can say, oh, it's possible.
You believed it, and then you were successful.
So now it's saying, oh, why can, you know, if I can do it, then anyone else can do it. And that argument has been used from a white to black direction, from white people to black people as well.
Well, even like people like Candace Owens and Thomas Sowell and people like that use that as well.
Exactly. So, and that's weird. I had a whole theory about that. Like, that's one way to always guarantee to make sure that you're successful is to turn, as a black person, is to turn against other black people. If you find yourself in a place of privilege and you choose to take advantage of that privilege by saying, oh, why don't other black people do this? It's not that hard. It's so easy. I can go out there and do it. I feel as if you almost have to sell something. You have to sell, you know, the only thing that you can't get rid of, and that is the color of your skin, to be able to say that. Yeah. Because then you no longer are now, in a sense, respected. If you have to then downplay and play the role of the oppressor against the people that look like you, you've now, and to me that's like, I'd say unforgivable, personally, but
I hadn't thought really that much about that. Whenever
I have time to think about it because it blows my mind how some people do.
The way that I view that is more of like there's a kernel of truth in there as far as, is it possible for a black person to be successful? Yes. If you make good decisions, will it increase your chances of being successful? Also, yes.
Circumstances and environment has to play as well. Can't forget.
However, circumstances and environment play a huge role in that, and that is what's conveniently left out. So it's like partially true, and that's where we get a lot of the divide, right, between like conservatives and liberals. It's like, see, look, we have this person that said black people can be successful, and they're black. It's like, they just have to make better decisions. It's like, yes, true, kind of. But also, there's this other part that you're totally missing. And I had to talk to Sam and Izzy about this as well. But it's like, and then so then you have the people that are like, oh, it's all the environment. It's like, well, no.
It could be, in a sense. Think about. Let's say
it very well could be, but the likelihood that if you make all the best decisions for you, that you are not going to at least go somewhere, I would say is probably very low.
But on the contrary,
if you make all the best decisions, the environment can still
defeat you, essentially.
It can. So it's like,
So let's say you make all the wrong decisions in the right environment. You have a good family. You have friends that'll look out for you. You have a good school that comes to your name. You can make the wrong decisions
and
based on your environment,
and still turn out okay.
That
100%. Right. That's the difference. And I'm not disputing that, but what I'm saying is it creates the divide between people who are both partially true, but they think it's all the way true, and then they just yell at each other. And when those two sides are fighting, they're fighting, and they're not working to find the solution, which is what the issue needs, not more yelling, because we've seen plenty of that over the last 4 or 5 years. So, yeah, so to your point that if you make bad decisions in the right environment, you'll probably be okay, 100% true. My point was more of like the divide that's been created by 2 points of view that are both partially true. Is like there's not a binary. It's not a binary. It's a complex issue with full of nuance. And to turn it into a binary does a disservice to all the people who find themselves in that position, one. And two, does a disservice to all the people who are trying to make policies to help, even if they even are trying to help at this point. Because then they have to pick a side because they're not going to get reelected anymore. And so that creates the issue of the people that are making the policy have to pick a side. And then they just argue. And when they're arguing, again, they're not finding the solution, which doesn't help the people that are in the predicament in the first place. And that's where we are. And it especially happened when the Democrats moved away from being the party of like the individual and kind of moved towards, like we were talking about earlier, they moved towards being Republicans light as far as the businesses supporting them. And so now nobody's looking out for the individual. Instead, they're just arguing with each other about, I won't say nothing, but like nothing productive for people who actually need the help. And instead play off cultural of like, yeah, we'll get these votes because you need us to like give you welfare because you're not going to get out anyways. And they play off that for votes. And then they just argue about nothing. And so now nobody's looking out for the interests of the individual. So you have the George Floyd killing, nobody looking out for the individual, and then COVID. So people are scared, cooped up, being inside. And then all this happens, and you have the Black Lives Matter people, the people that, not that they don't care, but are more interested in burning the whole thing down and starting over.
Now, what do you mean by that? Like individuals?
Individuals who are more interested in the tearing down of the United States, like the system as a whole, rather than the Black Lives Matter police brutality focused movement. And it creates this kind of like weird. This is one of the things that I haven't fully put together in my head, right? The pieces are there, and I haven't fit them all together. The movements, the civil unrest is all there for what it seems to me, the reasons that nobody's looking out for the individual, so they think that they don't have a say, and so this is how they're putting their say. Also, Black Lives Matter, and those are two different.
You could argue, or I'll try and put it into a perspective that you might see. So the idea of the Black Lives Matter movement was created as a solution to a symptom of a greater problem.
Right.
The symptom is police brutality.
Right.
The whole idea of Black Lives Matter is that, yes, as the statement says, all lives matter, but Black lives aren't being, or why all lives aren't being killed. The whole ordeal with all of these Black people getting hung in trees in 2020.
Yeah.
That's not a suicide.
No.
There is no sense in this world where that makes sense as a suicide. Right? So the idea of Black Lives Matter movement is to protest those things, to bring attention to specifically police brutality and I guess now lynchings in 2020. Right?
Right, which is crazy that we even have to talk about
the fact that those words are together without not in there it doesn't make sense.
No.
But that's the reality of the world we're living in now. So when you have people when that's all they focus on, that's one thing. There are people who are now within the movement who understand that it's a symptom. We're not just fighting police brutality because if you fix the police, you still have to deal with the legal system, you still have to deal with the education system, you still have to deal with, and I guess you can call it the financial system.
Right.
So it's a bigger institution of racism that just is spewed over now, or has been spewed over.
It's been infused in how
exactly
the country deals with
black people.
Well, everything really.
I mean, everything, but then that's directed towards black people. Think about
Right.
everything that has been set up to disadvantage them.
Mm-hmm.
Then the Black Lives Matter movement is now created in protest to one pillar of that, and that is police brutality.
Right.
So the people who are in there saying to fix the entire system, you then have to, not essentially break it, but you have to then restructure the entire system.
But
There's some truth to that.
There is truth to that, but the architecture or the framework.
What do you mean about their words or the framework of the
framework
system?
the framework of the United States government? Like if you take all the people out
Mm-hmm.
and all the the unwritten policies
Mm-hmm.
that go to keep the black community down and
Mm-hmm.
dependent, if you because
Not much of it's written. It's just how people
right.
interpret.
So that's what I'm saying. If you take all those the people out,
And
if you were just to refill them with people that
Believe
new
it.
slots,
Mm-hmm.
I think the architecture could use some tweaking probably.
Oh, yeah,
Just
without doubt.
with to come along with the times.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a good system from the standpoint of
It's a good system if it works.
It doesn't allow one person to get too much power.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't allow for mostly that, right? The tyrannical nature.
Mm-hmm.
But what's happened is they've all gotten swept up in the system, and now they're all tyrannical and they're all corrupt.
Mm-hmm.
And so when they say the system needs breaking, it's yes, but it's the people that need to get removed.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the architecture itself. And I had another thing that I was going to say, but I forgot.
Let's say you replace. Now, when you say the system and the people getting replaced, are you talking about specifically elected officials?
Yeah. So if you have the House of Representatives and the Senate,
Yes.
and how that works, it's that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
But the people in it and how they act to cover their backs, that's what needs to go. Not the fact that we have a Senate and a House of Representatives and a president and a vice president and the cabinet. That's all good. Is when the people in them become corrupt that the system then becomes corrupt. So if you were to look at it as roster slots, it's there's not or a playbook, right? You have on an NFL team, right? You have the roster slots. It's the way that they structured the roster is fine, but the people that fill out the roster are the problem. Does that make sense? Kind of.
Because if you're picking it, how you said it earlier, if you have the whole thing with the SEAL being, a SEAL, is it a platoon or
platoon? Yeah.
Platoon. If you have a corrupt platoon, you can more or less kind of fix it by putting a correct leader in.
Yeah, a good leader.
Exactly. So it's the same way with the less elected officials. If you have a government that doesn't really run, that represents all people, and is not doing the best for all of its citizens, change the leaders out.
Yeah.
And you'll probably see the rest of the institution. And do I think that is the sole thing that you need to change?
No.
Because
but that is a bigger part than I think people realize. Leadership needs to be better, and right now they don't have an interest in changing how they run because right now it benefits everybody. So they have an interest.
In some ways,
the people that are in the government
who have the power to influence the government.
Yeah.
They don't want to see things change. That doesn't mean
because
individuals like you and us want to see things change.
No, that's yes. So what I meant was the people that are in the government running things. They have no interest to see anything change because they're winning right now. Why would they want to see things change? If things change, then they might lose. That wouldn't be good for them. So that comes down to look who we've got as our candidates: a Dusty Cheeto and a guy that can't even speak properly on his own commercial on YouTube. It's neither. The one thing I will say about Trump was that he was supposed to be the guy that wasn't the establishment, and he has not done a great job.
You look at his track record before he got into politics. You could tell he wasn't going to be able to be the one. The fact that he ran on the platform of being the businessman. Right?
I think everyone knew that, but they were so fed up with the system being the way it was. It doesn't excuse him winning, right?
His campaign told him how he was going to be,
and
stuff he said on that campaign trail was atrocious.
Right. It was horrible, and I don't mean to excuse it or turn it into oh yeah, he's fine. It's no, absolutely not. Horrible. Should not fit for president. However, when the other option was Hillary Clinton, who we talked about earlier, like the whole Benghazi thing, and then the sale of uranium to Russia, and then
Her track record.
Yeah, her track record as far as being corrupt, atrocious. So it's like you take the moron or the corrupt politician that knows how to work the system for her own advantage. Some people want to take the moron, and like I don't blame them for that. And so now the Democrats had a great chance to put in somebody like Tulsi Gabbard or Andrew Yang, who are well spoken. They like Tulsi Gabbard, woman of color, 2 deployments overseas, very articulate, incredibly intelligent, young enough to be like charismatic. And have the energy to lead. But no, they picked Joe Biden. You know what the one problem with Tulsi was? She wasn't corrupt. It's like, dude, come on. So now it's like, I blame the Democratic Party for where we are from the standpoint of they had options, both election cycles, to put anyone else. And they didn't do it. So that's I mean, obviously that's a big problem. But like, so if anyone was going to run third party, Now's the time. And to anyone who's going to be like, well, it's a vote for the other party, it's like, okay, well, then I won't vote. It's like, well, you're not doing your civil duty to vote, but you can't vote for anyone other than 2 parties. I don't want to hear it this election cycle at all. Because, I mean, do I even have to spell out the reasons, honestly?
Is there a third party candidate running right now?
Not one that I know of. It's
This whole election cycle is so unorthodox with COVID-19 going on. Like
really
people just kind of taking their hands off the whole idea of it.
Well,
not necessarily like citizens, but people who are interested.
Well, what's super wacky is there's no debates now because of COVID.
There would have been already debates going through the whole summer too. Then I think about it, we've already at least had
so
candidates.
we would have already had debates. We would have already seen that neither of them is fit for the office. And it's a little bit depressing, I guess, that this is what we're left with. So I don't know, honestly, but we'll see. I guess what I really hope happens is that Biden picks a vice president who's competent.
Younger than him.
Way younger. Shortly afterwards, becomes completely incoherent, and then whoever he picked has to run the country.
So that way we have
maybe
a better option.
Maybe. Will that happen?
We have to see. Only time will tell.
Probably not, because he hasn't picked his vice president yet.
Very true.
Which is, I don't even know how we got on this. What were we talking about?
What were we talking about? We kind of been all over the place.
We've been all over the place. Oh yeah, so people that want to take the whole system down.
That's right.
And the whole economic system as well. It's like what happened with capitalism, at least how I see it, is the capitalism started to touch things that it shouldn't touch, like healthcare, science, politics, and the media.
And not just the way of like funding campaigns, but
how they're run.
Well, not even that. I'm talking like foreign interference, like being able to, like the whole thing with Ukraine and paying other countries to interfere. Yeah, that's
like. But as far as like they're all run for profit now, like those institutions, I'm sure there's probably one or a couple others, but like healthcare should not be run for profit. Science should not be run for profit. Science should be run to explore and have like. Figure out ways to better humanity, right? The scientific method. Figure out how to get a better society. Technology to help people like live longer, be healthier, right? All that should not be run for profit. Media should not be run for profit because then they don't have an interest anymore in telling people the truth. They have an interest in making money. Politics don't have an interest in helping the people. Have an interest in making money.
Or helping the people who pay them make money.
Yeah, so it's like this whole... So, like, capitalism touched things that it shouldn't have touched. I think, would you use crony capitalism? It's like people want to dismantle capitalism. It's like, no, how about crony capitalism? Like, we can get rid of how capitalism touches these things that have perverted what they should be. Like the Enlightenment science values of the West is like that's one of the things that makes Western culture what it is, as great as it is, and it's been perverted. And it's not right. It's not that science is a bad thing or capitalism is a bad thing, but when they touch, that's a bad thing. And I feel like that's another important distinction to make. I don't know, like we talked about that earlier, but how do you feel about that?
I don't believe that companies should be able to fully fund campaigns. The idea that if an individual is in a seat and they're voting against, bills or laws that will then, or voting on the side of bills or laws that will prohibit companies or,
directly impact the company that
directly impact companies and allow them to not make as much money or put regulations. Let's say we're talking about coal or natural gas.
Yeah.
Right. And if you're putting in policies that give the EPA more ability to then put restrictions on how much oil can then get pumped, or even how much natural gas gets, what's the word? Excavated. I believe you can excavate. However you get it out of the earth. But if you're an individual who let's say you introduce that bill, and you're trying to really make it make steam, a gas company can then just
lobby for the other side.
Lobby, or if there's another candidate who's running against you, who's saying, I would never do that, I'm here to save the jobs, the coal miners and all of this. Yeah. The company can then pour as much money as it wants into that campaign to help put out ads, to help put up signs, and to help make sure that your message and this candidate can then be more visible than the other one. Will that guarantee a seat? No. Are the chances higher that it will likely win that seat? It does increase. Yeah. So if you have a grassroots campaign, and it happened in Fredericksburg, if you have a grassroots campaign versus an incumbent who's already established and may have donors or political action committees that will just want to pour in money towards his campaign and help him make sure that he can keep that seat, who are you really there representing then? Yeah, what are your interests? You're not helping the people who put you in position.
You're representing the people that gave you the money to get you the seat.
Exactly. Or to help you keep the seat. And that's one thing I learned in poli-sci early on, was that representatives don't necessarily get elected to then help people. They get elected to make sure that they get reelected. Yep. You don't get into a position to hopefully get, change the world in an election cycle and then get voted out. No. You get in because you want to. You can't make change as a newbie anyways. As a freshman representative, you're not going to be able to make that much change. Right. The goal in getting elected,
anyways, but that's a different problem.
Very different problem. The goal in getting elected is to make sure that you can then turn it. Most people try and turn it into a career. Yep. Be there for years, actually try to make change. Some don't. They choose that this isn't for them. If they try to come in and actually make a change and realize there are mountains of either other representatives, colleagues that they'll work with, or just steps or policies in place that make it way harder than it should be. They choose it's not for them. Yeah. There are some who have went in with the idea that if I'm here for 10 years, then I now have power. Right. You know what I mean? I now have sway over the people, and people like to respect that. If your representative has been in his seat for 15 years, and he's gotten, he's thrown you breadcrumbs here and there. Yeah. If you apply enough pressure for him that doesn't go against his party's agenda, he can provide it for you. Then you see it as, he's done this for us and he's done that for us. As long as you have a good track record that says I've helped the people of this district, then you can say that he may do all these other things, or he may accept money from this group, or
but he helps me, so I don't care. But he helps
me here, so I don't care. And the amount of politicians who are in place who have that reputation, who may not be, clearly don't have the best track record, but they've done, nickels and dimes for the people of their community. They understand that if we want to be able to try and get stuff done, this person has power, this person has sway, he has leverage, he's the chairman of some committee, and if we want to try and get stuff done, we can at least try and get it through. Yeah. I don't believe that's how politics should be run. No. Now, who am I to say? I don't know.
You're somebody who understands how the system works and has watched it fail.
Representation is meant to be, you're not, regardless of what your beliefs are, regardless of whether you agree with something or not, if it helps the people of your constituency, and that's what they want. Granted, you can try and advise them against it if it's something that actually can bring them harm. But if that's what they want, you're not there to decide whether or not it's right or wrong for them. You're there to represent them. Period. Yep. So, and granted, it's not just one person making a decision, but you're supposed to vote on something based on the people you represent.
That's how it should be in every institute. Like every institution, as far as if you're representing a population. You should live there. You should understand what the people want who live there.
Mm-hmm.
You should not be a career politician. You should not be in it for the money. That's one of those things with like people who are working like what's called the public service.
Mm-hmm.
You're there to serve the people you represent.
Mm-hmm.
Same with the cops.
Mm-hmm.
When the police department doesn't have the same makeup as the area that is policing, not good.
Mm-hmm.
Because you don't have people who are police. You need like the police need to be people who are from that community, so they understand what the problems that community faces, and therefore are better equipped to handle them.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with Congress.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not from whatever district you're representing, you don't know what they need.
Mm-hmm.
Frankly, you don't care because you're getting donations from whoever, big companies. Yeah, and so it goes back to the money needs to come out of politics, out of healthcare, science,
Mm-hmm.
and the media.
Mm-hmm.
So without those
You
four
start
things,
with those 4.
those are the biggest 4 because the media can basically. So if the money is in science, and science isn't doing real accurate science, the media doesn't have to tell you the truth on what they're doing anyways. So do you remember when CDC came out and said masks don't do anything for coronavirus, like they should only be used if you're a healthcare worker? So Fauci came out later and was like, we said that because we were worried there was going to be a shortage of masks. They literally lied to everyone. Bad science, bad media. He's involved in politics, so we can say bad politics too. You lied to an entire country
Based on the idea.
Based on the theory that there might be a shortage of masks. You know what would happen if you say, hey, everybody should wear masks. Don't buy them, please, because the healthcare people need them. Companies would start making them.
The question is, would people actually believe that and choose not to? Because think about the whole idea of capitalism, as we talked earlier, is to get something for you and your family to make sure you're secure. Because that's the system we live in. It allows you to do that, and that's kind of what's incentivized.
That's how individuals live within the system. Capitalism is built off, I have a product or service, you're willing to pay a certain amount for it on the market. That's our exchange. Yeah. But
you just said there are people who are going to see it like that. So regardless if they came out and said, hey, you need masks, but don't buy too much, there were going to be people who weren't going to listen to that in the first place. Even if they didn't even hear that.
But would you rather them lie, or would you rather them tell the truth and let it work itself out? I'd rather them
tell the truth. But my issue goes beyond that. And the fact of the matter is that we're kind of stuck in where we are now. We're kind of talking about more recent stuff. But if you look back towards the end of January and all of February, we were prepared for a pandemic style of virus to come around. We have a PPE stockpile that the federal government had.
Yeah.
Trump ended up selling the majority of ours to China when it blew up over there, and it started getting actual like headlines saying, "Oh, there's a virus in China. It could spread out." We were end up selling all of our PPE, all of our masks, all of our face shields and ventilators to China. When it reached us, we realized we didn't have it.
We didn't have anything.
We have nothing. There was a I forget specifically which company, but there was a company that was talking to someone in the government. I just got to look this up, and we can talk about this after. But there was a company that was asking, we see something coming because all of the stuff that we had for sale, all of our masks just sold out within like a week.
Yeah.
When something like that happens, you realize that there's an issue and there potentially could be a shortage. The red flag was raised back in like February and March before it even got to America. And
before a lot of it got here.
So the fact of the matter is, regardless of what he's saying, regardless of anything that happened, we could have been prepared for it. We could have been prepared for it. He could have been if we were more prepared. If our stockpile hadn't been decimated. If we hadn't sold it all to China, and if the companies could have, and I guarantee I'm pretty sure it was contract, and that was the whole reason that the person didn't end up manufacturing all of these because he didn't have a need to, even though he could have sold them privately. But there was a government contract, I think, that went out to Honeywell to make a bunch of masks. The company that was prepared before Honeywell got the contract was a different company, and he was the one raising the red flag. I have to look this up.
That's the issue with government contracting, though, which has its whole. It's ingrained, but that's its own set of. That's almost a different beast that you got to take care of on its own, because government contracting sees friends who are in the government that work for companies that say, yeah, I'll write this to make sure that your company wins.
Exactly.
And it doesn't matter what race that person is, doesn't matter who that person is, as long as there's a relationship there, that's what not all, but a big enough chunk to where it's a big problem of that goes. So that's like...
And that's partly what happened with this, is where he didn't receive the contract. So he had like 3 manufacturing plants that could have been putting out between like 15 and 20 million masks a week within a span of 3 months. But back in like February, by the time May and June came around, we'd be good by now.
Yeah.
Or even throughout that process,
we'd be better.
We'd be better.
But even so, it's like if you go implore to the American people, say, hey, look, this is coming. The healthcare professionals need the masks. Please make your own because you will need them. I'd so much rather have them come out and said that than be like, no, they don't do anything.
I think that's where the issue is, saying that they didn't do anything.
Right.
If they would have said
it was a flat out lie, and science, media, politics, all touched by capitalism in this instance, and that shows why it failed. I don't know. That whole it's so convoluted, it's so complex that you try and pull the thread on one part of the system, and then you
realize you're pulling the whole thing.
And then you pull into another thread, and then you pull the other thread, and it's a different part, and then before you know it, you've got this big ass tangle of your headphones get tangled in your pocket. It's like that times a million. That's what it's like.
When you're talking about someone on that scale, you're dealing with things way
yeah, it's so complex. Did you have? I think you mentioned before we started that you had something that you wanted to touch on, or did we get it all?
I think we got everything.
We got everything. So, Mr. Jason has his own podcast.
Yes, and New Perspective. We have an episode hopefully coming out this weekend. You can follow us on Instagram at ANP Podcast. Find us on YouTube at A New Perspective Podcast as well. And we'll have a video out shortly, kind of discussing on the same things we discuss as well. A good friend of mine and I are just sitting down and kind of talking about everything that we see going on now and what our perspective is on it. Hence the title.
Sounds good. Everybody go check out Jason's podcast. We'll see you all for the next episode. Bye, everybody.